Welcome back, everyone. I know that this is the title is probably going to make a lot of right-leaning people be like, "Oh my God, what is Jinx doing now?" But just hear me out on this. This came from a debate, solely for the sake of debate, between a friend and I, and it was all hypothetical. But during this hypothetical debate, I reached the conclusion that I think Ben Shapiro's argument of facts before feelings is not necessarily dangerous, but it can lead to a misrepresentation of what that argument actually means. That is something that I would fundamentally philosophically disagree with, and I'll get into that. So I wanted to create a chart of this, but I didn't have time. So I'm just going to have to deal with the tombstone and a picture of Ben Shapiro. So he was talking to me about developing a birth control device that gives males the ability to abort a child with the push of a button. So males would have ultimately this say-so of whether or not they want to engage in parenthood. And if they don't, and the woman doesn't want an abortion, well, you can just push a button and it will abort the child without any invasive surgeries. And this can be done through some kind of hypothetical, futuristic technology. Now, I broke it down into segments because there's a philosophical problem here. And that is, for the first tier, you have co-op, which is both parties involved don't want to engage into parenthood. And usually, abortion is usually a very difficult decision. And anyone that I've ever known to have an abortion, they've had to pay for it. It's not been paid for by the government. So I'm just going to put that. This is not an argument for or against abortion. Okay, this is a hypothetical scenario, futuristic type stuff. So keep that in mind. But my problem with it was, okay, so if you have the co-op, both people are saying, yes, we want an abortion, we don't want it. And we're still sticking to the first trimester. We're not doing the second, third trimester crap. So I said, then there's the first person tier, which would be the female. So let's say that she wants to have the abortion, but the male doesn't. The male wants to engage in fatherhood. Well, this is a gray area. This is somewhat of a conundrum because you have conflicting ideas, but ultimately I think in this situation of the first person, of the female, I think they have a little bit more authority and power due to bodily autonomy. And I do agree that a male should have a say-so in whether or not they want to embark in parenthood or not. I think that's absolutely a legitimate claim for a male to desire to embark in fatherhood or not to embark in fatherhood. But because of bodily autonomy, the female, unfortunately for the male, has more say-so in this regard because it is ultimately her body housing the fetus, and the fetus is literally a part of her body. So then there's the second person scenario, which would be the male's perspective. And again, this is another gray area, another philosophical conundrum, because as I said, the male does have a right should have a say-so in whether or not they want to embark into parenthood or not. Now, when it comes to that, I have to say that this is going to be harder for the male, but you can reach a mutual agreement. Let's say the male doesn't want to embark into parenthood, but the female does. She said, "I'm going to have this baby," and the male's like, "Well, I don't want to embark. I'm not ready for parenthood. I'm not, financially stable. I'm not responsible. I would make a good parent, whatever." So there is a mutual agreement that could take place where the female says, well, that's fine. I'm going to go ahead and have the kid. You don't have to be a part of their life. You don't have to claim them as your own. I will rear them on my own. I will find somebody that does want to be a father figure in their life, etc., etc. That would be a mutual agreement. But again, this is a gray area, a philosophical conundrum, both first person and second person, the male and female perspective. They both have legitimate claims, and there's probably some kind of mutual satisfactory agreement that can be reached, but there's also the possibility that one can't be reached, and that is unfortunate. But to give a male the sole power and ability to abort a child from a mother against her will and unknowingly, well, that's a bit authoritarian. And to which this person responded, I don't care. And I said, well, what about the psychological trauma that this could induce to the female? Because, I mean, if they have a fetus growing inside of them, this is absolutely a part of their body, and you have the nurturing nature and, you know, this bond that a mother has with the child, and you just rip this fetus out of her womb with the press of a button against her will and without her acknowledgement, without her knowing. It's just poof, surprise, it's gone. That can lead to emotional trauma, and that's when the talking point was regurgitated to me, only it was done more like this: boo-hoo-hoo, cry, wah, 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 SJW, my feelings, I don't give a fuck about your feelings. Facts before feelings. Now, I realize that when Ben Shapiro uses this argument, he is pertaining to what is offensive, not what is psychologically traumatizing. As I pointed out to him later, I said, well, how do you argue against pedophilia if it's facts before feelings? If we're going to say that psychological trauma is not a measure of something that we can put on the moral compass, well, then he comes forward and says, well, morality is subjective. And I said, well, yes, that is true. Morality is subjective, but that doesn't negate the necessity for morality. For it is morality, the human conception of morality, that separates us from the animal kingdom. Animals react on impulse, whereas human beings have created a moral scale, and our frontal lobe is predominantly in control of that says, well, hey, wait a minute, let's think about this here. Is this the right thing to do? Let's use empathy, let's use sympathy, let's use logic, let's use reason, let's use rationality, let's use all these things to come to a conclusion. Is this the right thing to do? And so, while, yes, morality is subjective, that doesn't mean that it's not necessary. And why it has evolved over time. We look at the biblical ages, and what we perceive as morality today is very different than they would have perceived during biblical times. And even before biblical times, back in the polytheistic religions, morality would have been perceived entirely different as well. So I'm saying, yes, morality is subjective, but that doesn't negate the utility of morality. It's a higher brain functioning thing. It is absolutely a product of our frontal lobe and cerebral cortex, and it is absolutely necessary that we have some kind of measure of morality, be it subjective or not. But when it comes to psychological trauma, things like PTSD, they can actually cause physical manifestations. And I asked him, are we in agreement with that? I mean, do you agree that a psychologically traumatizing event can manifest itself in physical forms? And the answer to that, we did agree on that. We did agree because, for example, pedophilia, PTSD from war vets, people who have sustained massive amount of psychological and emotional abuse or physical abuse even can create psychological trauma from someone's childhood that can manifest it. The psychological trauma can create things like anxiety, panic disorder, major depression, and those things can manifest themselves in physical manifestations. They can be even debilitating if you look at things like catatonic depression. So we came to a mutual agreement on that. Okay, so he said, well, why don't we create a mind control device to suppress the naturalistic impulse of the nurturing nature of the mother, so that she doesn't have the bond with the fetus that creates this psychological trauma. And I'm like, well, now you're talking about controlling the contents of somebody's mind. And I think if there's anything that you have absolute domain or dominion over, is the contents of your own thoughts. No one has access to those. No one can control those. Your thoughts, the things that go on in your head, belong to you and you alone. No one should ever have the right or ability to control what goes on within the contents of your own mind, no matter how deplorable, depraved they are. The thing is do you act on them? Are you cognitively, consciously aware of the cause and effect relationship that they would have in the real world? And that is the important thing about that. So the contents of your mind are your own, your dreams, your fantasies, your imagination, like anything that your mind can concoct is your own, and no one has any domain over that. So at one point, we got into the philosophical discussion where he compared taking the fetus as the same thing as taking a book, and also pointing a middle finger at somebody. So let's say somebody's hypersensitive to having their middle finger pointed at them, and they get triggered and they become emotional. I said, well, there's a different concept behind being flipped off. And I mean, if somebody's not likely to have psychological trauma from being flipped off, even repeatedly. They might get annoyed by it and they might become callous to it. I said, but we're talking about stealing a fetus, like a living, growing part of a female's body from her without her knowing. That is a little different. We can't compare those two. Again, it's going back to that facts before feelings argument. And it's like, well, I mean, we have to tier this into different categories. There's a big difference between being offended and having something happen to you that causes deep psychological trauma. The facts before feelings argument absolutely does not apply in the scenario of psychological trauma. It just doesn't work. Hence, I have this tombstone where I don't think any reasonable person would ever do this. Let's say Ben Shapiro's youngest child died, and somebody had the goal to put on the tombstone of this child, don't cry over my death. It's a natural conclusion to life. Remember, facts before feelings. Right, Ben Shapiro? I don't think any reasonable person would do that. And I think that mourning and grievance over the loss of a child like that would be absolutely appropriate. And the majority of the population, I think any reasonable person really would understand that kind of psychological impact would definitely manifest itself. This is not a facts before feelings argument when you're talking about the death of a child. This is a reasonable expression of emotion. Absolutely reasonable. So he compared the taking of the fetus to the taking of property, and he brought up the example of a book. And I was like, hold on a minute. We're comparing taking away a fetus from a mother, like straight out of her, without her knowing, without her acknowledgement, to somebody stealing your book. And I said, well, first of all, I'm pro private property. So, don't steal my stuff. But the thing is, you come into my place and you steal a book of mine. Yeah, that's really annoying, and I'm going to be irritated by it, but eventually I'll get over it. Even if the book, let's say, is really rare and hard to find, I might harbor a grudge against that forever, but ultimately I'm not going to be psychologically traumatized by somebody stealing a very hard to find, rare, collectible book. Eventually I will get over it, and I might be like, damn it, I wish I still had it from time to time. I said, let me put it to you in a different context. Let's say, okay, so I come in and I steal your book, yeah, whatever, that's annoying. Let's say it's rare. Okay, that's even more annoying, but eventually you're going to move on, life will go on. And same with the next example that I'm going to get to. But it carries with it a different weight. I said, what if I came in and stole, and this person is a big fanatic of their computer. They love computers, they love technology. What if I came in and stole your computer? And to which the response was a lot of stuttering, and but there's a lot of there's private, and then he goes, oh, I get what you're saying. There's a deeper emotional attachment to it based on what it is. And I'm like, exactly. Imagine the level of emotional attachment a mother has to a growing baby inside of her that is literally a part of her body at that moment in time. So we can't compare taking objects from people, thievery, to taking a child out of a female's womb with the press of a button through some kind of hypothetical, like, technological advancement. And ultimately, what really bothered me was the whole, crybaby, SJW, facts before feelings argument, and that is that we are, at that point, there has been a negation of the concept that there are things where feelings and facts kind of coalesced, where they exist side by side. We understand psychological trauma, and we understand that psychological trauma is something that it gets to the point where it's like unbearable and does manifest itself not just psychologically but physically, like you become lethargic, or you become unable to do certain things without severe amounts of anxiety. And there have even been people who have known to collapse, and people who go into catatonic depression. There's all kinds of things, all kinds of examples of this. We can look at neurology and psychology, for example, and even medical science to do that, which I mentioned to him, if you're going to argue against that, you're arguing against a lot of scientific evidence. So, again, I'll bring this up, okay, so here's this tombstone, child dies. No, don't worry about it, don't cry. Facts before feelings, remember. I don't think any reasonable person would make that argument when they've experienced the death of a loved one. I don't think any reasonable person would make that argument to a person who has been raped, or somebody who has been brutally abused, or to somebody who has escaped someone who ultimately had the plan of killing them slowly over a period of time. These things are psychologically traumatizing and have a permanent effect on the brain, and this in turn has a physiological response. So it really bothers me that the facts before feelings argument is being presented towards things that would be considered psychologically traumatizing instead of just what is offensive. Like things that you find offensive would be like, I could utter a word that could be perceivably offensive. That word itself has no dominion over you unless you allow it. However, stealing from somebody there's more of a emotional bond formed between, your private ownership, but there's even more of an emotional bond to that which is like things like children or loved ones, etc. So are we really going to put the facts before feelings argument in front of something that is psychologically traumatizing? When he came up with the whole brain control device that would subdue the part of the brain that is responsible for the nurture effect, essentially, that exists within the mother, I had big issue with that as well. And he asked me, well, what would you say if we use this mind control device to, let's say, stop pedophiles and serial killers? And I said, well, that is a well-formed argument. That is absolutely true. You got me on the cusp on that one, because the thing is, if we had such a device that did that, then yeah, okay, like in that context, it's like we would be using authoritarianism to prevent somebody from imposing their will on others against their own will. So using authoritarianism to combat unnecessary authoritarianism, to which I understand. But again, I also understand a little bit about like the neurology. So in the neurology, when we're talking about antisocial disorder or personality disorder, this is a brain that is missing gray matter. So essentially you have parts of the brain that aren't active. We're talking about a broken brain, a brain that has not developed properly. And what you can do to fix that is by stimulating parts of the brain that are inactive so that they become active, and thus fixing the problem. And I think that's a much more liable solution than brain control and suppressing a part of the brain, because my concern with that is if you, and many psychologists and neurologists have been bringing this up for many years now, is that when we're talking about like SSRIs and treatment of different psychological illnesses such as depression and anxiety, etc., is that when you mess with one brain system, you mess with the whole fucking thing. And this is a problem that we need to rectify, is that we need to focus on fixing the brain, not subduing a part of the brain, because what happens when you subdue the part of the brain, you end up changing the personality, you end up changing their moral compass, you end up changing their ability to empathize and sympathize. You could essentially create a sociopath by playing Frankenstein. So another parallel I see in this argument is that this is absolutely what Frankenstein is about. You know, it's like, what is the efficacy? It's really asking that philosophical question. Are we playing with something that we ought to be playing with, or is this something that ought to be left alone? That is an intriguing question, but. You know, when we're talking about controlling the contents of someone's brain, I made the comment, I was like, oh, yes, absolutely, that's a great idea, especially, you know, if it gets in the hands of social justice warriors, you know, the alt-left, or in the hands of the alt-right neo-Nazis. I mean, can you imagine what they would do with such a technology? I mean, the people they don't like would be running off of a cliff like lemmings. So, and then he goes, oh, good, you agree with me. And I said, no, I am making the opposite assertion. I'm basically saying that this is a bad idea because the people who oppose you could use this technology against you, against your will. And ultimately, I said, I think this argument boils down to, I'm a male, and I want to be able to have sex without a condom without facing the ramifications of my actions. So I don't want to take responsibility for my actions. I just want to be able to do it. And I said, I don't understand, because I brought this point up multiple times. I said, I don't understand why you will not take my suggestion on creating a device that allows the male to control whether or not his semen, his sperm, is active or inactive, because that way there's no victim. And overall, that's what I'm looking at here, is that when you put the power in the male's hand over the fetus growing inside the woman, there's an actual victim involved. That female is a victim of somebody imposing their will against someone else, against their own will. And, you know, he's all about being 100% rational, and I had to explain the difference between rationality and logic. Logic is cause and effect relationship, like A plus B equals C. Rationality is Like, well, I don't. Christians rationalize being Christian. The alt-right rationalizes being alt-right. The alt-left rationalizes being alt-left. Rationality is a tool that everyone uses. You can be illogical and rational. You could be logical and irrational. This is totally and absolutely something that can be done. Here, hold on, let me read something real quick. So this here says, if someone is rational, we believe he is thinking and a reasonable man, not susceptible to emotions and feelings. Logical reasoning is required to cobble together pieces of evidence to prove guilt of a suspect in a crime. A person can be irrational, whereas it is his beliefs that are illogical. And I think that pretty much well sums it up. So I think I pretty much well substantiated that rationality does not equate to logic, because I think in this situation, this hypothetical situation of futuristic abortion technology is not taking into account the very nature of cause and effect relationship, which is, that there is a victim involved, that there is psychological trauma, and that is using logic, that is using facts, not just feelings. It's taking into account of psychological turmoil or psychological distress. And I think that everyone is rational to a degree. Like, everybody rationalizes what it is that they believe in, and they, like, I bet you Christians absolutely believe that Christianity is a logical conclusion, whereas I don't. So I don't see it as being logical. I mean, I could see coming to the rationale that Christianity is the way to go is an actual thing. That is a rational thing, but not logical. Logic is based on cause and effect relationship, facts, evidence, etc., etc. So I would like to know what you think about this brain control device and the efficacy of that, as well as the efficacy of being able for a male to be able to abort a child against a female's will. And also think about my proposal, why my proposal was not being credited or looked into. Is it a plausible alternative? Is giving the males the ability to make their semen active or not. This is, I think, a better solution to this hypothetical rather than the latter. But let me know what you think in the comment section below. Like, share, subscribe, hit the bell button on any channel you're subscribed to. And for all the right-leaning people that stuck through this, thank you very much. I know it looked weird from the get-go, but see that it's probably not what you thought it was. And I thank you for sticking it out. This is actually a philosophical conundrum, an actual philosophical, very interesting philosophical debate. So, and with that, I'm out.